Marcus walked down the quiet street with his hands in his jacket pockets, the night air cool against his skin. It had been another long day of work, and all he wanted was to get home, eat something warm, and rest. The street lights flickered softly, and the city seemed almost asleep, but Marcus knew better. He had lived here long enough to understand that silence did not always mean peace. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and kept moving, his footsteps steady on the cracked sidewalk. Out of nowhere, headlights cut across the road, and a patrol car rolled slowly toward him. Marcus glanced up, already sensing that this would not be just another night. The car stopped beside him, and the door opened. Two officers stepped out, their eyes sharp and voices clipped. One of them called out, "Hey, you there! Stop right where you are." Marcus stopped, his heart steady but heavy. He turned slowly, trying not to show frustration. "Good evening, officers," he said in a calm tone. He had been through enough in his life to know that raising his voice or showing irritation would only make things worse. The taller officer stepped closer, his flashlight shining directly into Marcus's face. "What are you doing out here this late?" he demanded. Marcus blinked against the light. "I'm just heading home from work," he replied, his voice even. "It's been a long shift." The second officer circled around him, looking him up and down as if every small detail was a clue to something suspicious. "Heading home, huh?" he said, with a laugh that didn't sound friendly. "You look like you're hiding something." Marcus stayed still. "I'm not hiding anything. I'm just walking home." But the officers were not satisfied with his simple answer. They moved closer, their voices louder, as though trying to prove something not only to Marcus but also to anyone who might be watching from the windows above. They asked for his ID, and Marcus calmly reached into his pocket to hand it over. He thought this would end the conversation, but the officer barely glanced at it before smirking and handing it back. "You sure this is your ID?" the taller one asked, as though the name and picture could somehow belong to someone else. Marcus nodded, but he did not speak further. He knew silence was often safer than too many words. The second officer folded his arms and leaned closer. "You're walking like you've got something to hide. Why don't you empty your pockets?" Marcus hesitated for only a second before slipping his hands into his pockets and pulling out his wallet, keys, and a folded receipt. He held them out calmly. "That's all I have," he said. The officers looked at the small pile of items as though expecting more. The taller one narrowed his eyes. "That's it? You expect us to believe that?" He took a step closer, his tone dripping with authority. "Why don't you take off your jacket?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his face composed. "Is that really necessary?" he asked. The officer's answer was firm. "Yes. Take it off." For a moment, Marcus thought about refusing, but he saw the way their hands rested near their belts, the way their eyes were watching him, not with care, but with suspicion. He slowly slipped his jacket off and handed it over. The officer patted the jacket roughly, checking the pockets, finding nothing. He tossed it back at Marcus with a look of annoyance. "Now the shirt," the second officer said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes, the power they thought they held in this moment. He also noticed movement at the corner of his vision. Someone had stepped out onto a balcony across the street. Another figure stood near a shop door, pretending to check their phone but clearly watching. A small audience was gathering. He drew in a slow breath. "Officers, I've told you I'm just heading home. You have my ID. You have everything in my pockets. Isn't that enough?" But they didn't answer his question. Instead, the taller one leaned in, his voice low but full of command. "Take off the shirt. Now." Marcus felt heat rise in his chest, not from fear but from the unfairness of it all. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that losing his composure would only give them more reason to push him further. He began unbuttoning his shirt, each button a reminder of the situation he was being forced into. His movements were slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving theirs. The second officer smirked, as if enjoying the moment. "That's better. Now we're getting somewhere." Marcus removed the shirt and handed it over, standing there in the cool night air with nothing but his undershirt. He could feel the stares of the small crowd growing larger, the whispers floating through the night. Some people shifted uncomfortably, others shook their heads, but no one spoke out. The officers searched the shirt pockets, running their hands over the fabric, but again, they found nothing. Their expressions showed irritation, as if the lack of evidence was somehow Marcus's fault. The taller one stepped closer, so close that Marcus could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. "What are you really carrying? You think you can fool us?" Marcus's voice stayed steady, though his patience was wearing thin. "I told you. I'm not carrying anything. I just want to go home." The officers exchanged a glance, as though daring each other to push the situation further. Then the second officer's lips curled into a cold smile. "Maybe we should check everything. Maybe he's got something hidden where we can't see." The words made Marcus's stomach tighten, but he refused to show it. He straightened his back, his eyes steady. Around him, the whispers from the onlookers grew louder. A few people lifted their phones higher, recording. The officers noticed but pretended not to care. The taller one chuckled, though it sounded forced. "You think those cameras are going to help you? You think anyone's going to care?" Marcus didn't reply. He knew that words were not always the most powerful weapon. Sometimes silence carried more weight than anything else. The officers pressed again, circling him, demanding more, as though the act of humiliating him was more important than finding anything real. Each second stretched long, heavy with tension. The street that had seemed so quiet only minutes ago now buzzed with the unspoken conflict between authority and dignity. Marcus stood firm, his face calm, his posture strong, refusing to break even as the officers tried to strip away his pride. He knew something they didn't, and though the moment burned with injustice, he held on to the quiet truth that would soon change everything. And as the crowd's murmurs grew, and the officers' frustration deepened, the stage was set for the discovery that would turn the night upside down. Marcus stood in the cool night air, his shirt already taken from him, his belongings displayed at his feet like evidence of crimes that never existed. His patience was being tested, but his face showed no cracks. The officers circled him slowly, as though searching for a weakness. Their voices carried through the street, sharp and commanding, demanding obedience, but Marcus stood firm. The taller officer crossed his arms, pretending to think. "You're still hiding something," he said finally, his tone heavy with false certainty. "Empty the rest of your pockets." Marcus spread his hands. "I already showed you what I had. My wallet, my keys, the receipt. You searched my jacket. You searched my shirt. That's everything." The second officer stepped forward with a smirk. "Not everything. Check your shoes. Maybe you've got something tucked away in there." Marcus glanced down at his shoes, then back at them. His calm voice cut through the tension. "Shoes now? Really? That's what this is about?" The taller one leaned closer. "Don't question us. Just do it." Around them, the small crowd of onlookers was growing. People who had been passing by stopped to watch. A young couple whispered to each other, pointing toward Marcus. An older man with a grocery bag paused on the corner, shaking his head quietly. A woman in her apartment leaned over her balcony, her phone raised high. Marcus noticed every detail, every eye that was now fixed on the scene. He slowly bent down, untied his laces, and slipped his shoes off. He handed them over without a word. The officers checked them, slapping the soles and shaking them upside down, but found nothing. When they tossed the shoes back at his feet, the taller officer's annoyance was clear. "This doesn't look good for you," he muttered, though even he must have known the words carried no meaning. Marcus straightened his shoulders. "I told you the truth from the start. I'm just heading home." But the second officer wasn't finished. His tone became more forceful, louder, as if trying to make the crowd believe his authority. "If you've got nothing to hide, then you won't mind taking off the rest. Let's make sure you're clean." The words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some gasped softly. A mother pulled her child closer to her side. A few people shook their heads in disbelief. But the officers ignored the reactions. Marcus felt his patience thinning, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could see the smirks on the officers' faces, the way they seemed to enjoy the power in that moment. He also knew that every camera recording would capture not only his calm but their actions. His silence was his shield, and his patience was his strength. He removed his undershirt slowly, folding it neatly before handing it over. His chest rose and fell steadily, showing no sign of fear, though inside he carried the weight of injustice pressing down on him. The officers rifled through the shirt as if searching for invisible secrets, but again, they found nothing. The taller officer's frustration boiled over. He jabbed a finger toward Marcus's pants. "Take those off too. We're not finished here." The crowd reacted louder now. Someone muttered angrily, another gasped, and a few voices rose in protest. But the officers turned on the voices sharply. "Mind your own business," the taller one shouted, his voice echoing across the street. Silence fell again, heavy and uneasy. Marcus looked at them calmly. "You've taken everything already. How much further do you want this to go?" The second officer smirked, as though daring him. "As far as it takes." "Do it." The street seemed to freeze. Every sound, the distant hum of a car, the creak of a door, the soft murmur of the crowd fell into the background as Marcus slowly began to obey. He loosened his belt and stepped out of his trousers, folding them carefully before handing them over. He stood tall, his dignity intact despite the attempt to strip it away. The officers checked the pants pockets, shaking them out, but as before, there was nothing. Their expressions darkened. The taller officer muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated. The second one glanced at the crowd, perhaps realizing how the scene looked, but his pride would not let him back down. Marcus stood silently, his gaze steady. The air around them was tense, as though everyone waited for the moment to break. The crowd shifted uneasily, torn between wanting to step forward and fearing what might happen if they did. Phones stayed raised, capturing everything. One voice broke the silence. "This isn't right," an older man called out from the corner, his grocery bag still in his hand. "You've taken enough from him." The officers turned sharply toward him, but before they could speak, another voice from the balcony above added, "Yeah, leave him alone." More voices followed, whispers turning into small shouts of disapproval. The officers' authority was cracking, the control slipping from their hands. Marcus said nothing, but inside, he felt a quiet strength. He had held his composure through every demand, every attempt to humiliate him. And now the crowd was beginning to see the truth. The officers weren't protecting anyone. They weren't searching for justice. They were simply trying to break him. The taller one tried to regain control. "Everyone stay back. This doesn't concern you." But his voice sounded less confident now, almost shaky. The crowd didn't move away. If anything, more people edged closer, drawn by the unfolding drama. The second officer looked back at Marcus, trying to mask his unease. "Where are you hiding it? You think we're stupid? You think we don't know who you are?" His words were sharp, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Marcus finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. "You've taken everything from me, but you still haven't found what you're looking for." Maybe it's because it was never there to begin with. The words cut through the night, simple but powerful. The crowd murmured in agreement. The officers stood frozen, caught between their pride and the growing realization that the situation was slipping beyond their control. Marcus stood tall, even in that vulnerable position, refusing to bow his head. His calm presence, his refusal to fight back with anger, was stronger than any resistance. And though the officers thought they held power, everyone watching could see where the real strength lay. The moment stretched, every eye locked on Marcus, every phone recording the scene. And in that stillness, the stage was set for the discovery that would expose the truth they had tried so hard to deny. The night had grown heavier, the street no longer quiet but buzzing with murmurs and the steady sound of phones recording. Marcus stood tall despite the humiliation, his clothes mostly taken from him, his belongings scattered on the ground. The officers looked restless, their faces showing irritation as they tried to keep their control. The taller officer wiped his forehead, the shine of sweat visible under the streetlight, while the second one paced back and forth like a man unsure of his next move. The crowd had grown larger. People who had been walking home stopped. Some leaned on car hoods, others peeked from nearby windows. The quiet neighborhood had become a stage, and Marcus was at the center, standing calm, silent, his steady breathing a contrast to the tension filling the air. The taller officer stepped forward again. "This isn't over. We'll find it. You're not walking away clean tonight." His words were sharp, but his tone betrayed his frustration. Marcus did not flinch. "You've searched everything," he said calmly. "There's nothing to find." The officer's jaw tightened. He grabbed Marcus's wallet again and opened it roughly, flipping through the cards and papers inside as though something new might suddenly appear. He pulled out a folded card tucked neatly behind the driver's license. His eyes narrowed as he turned it over, reading what was written there. For a moment, his expression froze, and his voice grew quiet. The second officer noticed his partner's pause. "What is it? Did you find something?" The taller officer didn't answer right away. He stared at the card, his eyes moving over the seal embossed at the top, the official lettering, the badge number printed clearly in bold. The silence grew heavy, the crowd leaning closer, curious. Finally, he spoke, though his voice cracked slightly. This is a badge." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. The crowd gasped almost in unison. The murmur of voices grew louder, disbelief spreading quickly. People whispered to one another, "A badge." And the sound carried across the street. The second officer snatched the card from his partner's hand, his eyes darting over it, his face draining of color. He looked back at Marcus, who stood calmly, his steady gaze unshaken. The officer stuttered, You're Marcus." Nodded once, firmly. "Yes. I'm with the Federal Investigations Unit." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words struck the officers like a hammer. The crowd erupted, voices rising louder now. "He's an officer too," one shouted. Another added, they didn't know who they were messing with. The phones lifted higher, recording every second, every stunned expression on the officers' faces. The taller officer's composure cracked completely. He looked at Marcus, then at the crowd, then back at the badge in his partner's hand. This can't be real," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew it was real. The seal, the signature, the number, it all confirmed what he feared. The second officer handed the badge back quickly, almost as if it burned his fingers. He stepped back, his bravado gone, his voice smaller. Why didn't you say anything?" Marcus's calm never wavered. He slipped the badge back into his wallet, his words measured and quiet but powerful enough to be heard by everyone. "Because the truth doesn't need to be shouted. You revealed yourselves without my help." The crowd cheered softly at his words. A young man near the front raised his fist in quiet support. The woman on the balcony leaned forward, shouting, "We've got this all on video." Another voice chimed in, "He stayed calm the whole time while you treated him like dirt." The taller officer's face turned pale. He looked around desperately, realizing the situation had slipped completely from his grasp. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. Finally, he muttered, "We didn't know." Marcus cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. That badge may mean authority to you, but I'm also a man. That should have been enough." The words hit harder than any shout could. The crowd grew louder, their support undeniable. Some clapped, others shouted in agreement, and the noise carried down the street. The officers stood frozen, caught in the storm of their own making. The second officer rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting nervously from Marcus to the crowd. "Listen, we may have gone too far. Maybe we should, just let this go." His attempt at retreat only made the crowd angrier. "Let it go? After all this," someone yelled. "No way." The taller officer tried again to control the moment, raising his hands as if to calm everyone. "All right, everyone settle down. This doesn't need to get bigger than it already is." But his words fell flat. The people weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to Marcus, watching him stand firm in the face of humiliation, dignity intact, authority shining without aggression. Marcus bent slowly to pick up his belongings, his movements deliberate. He slid his shoes back on, buttoned his trousers, and slipped into his jacket. He moved calmly, unhurried, every action a silent declaration that he would not be broken. When he stood upright again, he looked directly at the officers. "Everything you did tonight will follow you," he said simply. "The crowd saw it. The cameras caught it. You thought you were humiliating me, but in truth, you revealed yourselves." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The voices of the people drowned out the officers' silence. Some chanted Marcus's name, while others shouted words of support. It was no longer a confrontation, it had become a public reckoning. The taller officer's shoulders slumped, his authority shattered. The second one looked at the ground, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. They both knew the truth, this was bigger than them now. The evidence was undeniable. Marcus took one last look around the street. The people who had once stood silently now stood united, their voices stronger than before. He nodded slightly to them, acknowledging their support. Then he turned his gaze back to the officers. "You wanted to strip me of dignity," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the street. "But dignity isn't something you can take. It belongs to me, and I'll carry it with me long after this night." The word sealed the moment. The crowd erupted once more, louder than ever, and the officers stepped back, defeated, powerless against the truth now laid bare for all to see. Marcus walked forward, his step steady, his head held high. The badge was safe in his pocket, but more importantly, his dignity was untouched. And as he passed through the crowd, people moved aside respectfully, their voices rising in chants of support. The officers stood frozen, watching helplessly as their attempt to break him became their own undoing. And in that night, on that quiet street, a hidden truth had been revealed, one that would echo far beyond the block, carried by every witness, every recording, every voice that refused to stay silent. The night air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of what had just unfolded. Marcus stood tall, his badge safely tucked back in his wallet, while the two officers shifted uneasily before him. The crowd had swelled, filling the sidewalk and spilling into the street. Their voices buzzed like a restless storm, and the once quiet neighborhood had become a stage for truth. The taller officer tried to gather his composure. He raised his hand slightly, his voice reaching out above the noise. "Everyone, calm down. There's been a misunderstanding here." His words sounded hollow, like a man begging not to drown. The crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. Their attention belonged to Marcus. Marcus didn't move right away. He stood steady, breathing in slowly, letting the silence of his calm cut through the officer's nervous words. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, but it carried like a bell through the street. A misunderstanding? You forced me to take off my clothes in front of my neighbors. You mocked me, doubted me, and treated me like I was less than human. That was no misunderstanding. That was a choice. The crowd roared in agreement, shouts of "That's right," and "Tell them," echoing from every corner. The woman on the balcony waved her phone in the air, shouting, "We've got everything recorded." The second officer looked at his partner nervously, his voice smaller now. "Maybe we should just let him go. End it before this gets worse." But Marcus corrected him, his words sharp but calm. "You don't let me go. I was never supposed to be held. I never broke the law. You don't get to give me freedom I already had." The taller officer's face reddened. He tried again to control the moment. All right, enough. Everyone here needs to move along. This is official business." But the crowd only grew louder, their voices rising above his. They weren't afraid anymore. Marcus stepped forward, his calm presence like a stone in the middle of a rushing river. "You thought you held power tonight," he said evenly. "But look around. The people saw everything. Every word, every action. Authority without justice isn't power, it's weakness." The words sank deep into the crowd, and applause broke out. The officers shifted, their hands twitching as if searching for control that no longer existed. The taller one lowered his voice and leaned toward Marcus. "Listen, let's keep this quiet. We don't need this to go public. We can handle this right here." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "You've already lost that choice. This isn't just between us anymore. This street, these people, they're witnesses. And those cameras? They're truth you can't erase." The second officer tried to soften his voice, almost pleading. "Look, maybe we can work something out. We didn't know who you were." Marcus's answer came swiftly, steady as stone. "And that's the problem. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with dignity. Badge or no badge, I am still a man." The crowd erupted in cheers again. People raised their phones higher, recording every word. A chant began to rise low at first, then stronger, echoing off the buildings. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The taller officer's voice cracked under the pressure. "Enough! Everyone disperse!" But the chant drowned him out, louder and louder, until his words disappeared like smoke. Marcus took a step closer, his calm unshaken. "You wanted to humiliate me," he said quietly, though the street was silent enough to carry his voice. "But all you did was expose yourselves. Your badges are supposed to stand for protection, not pride. Tonight, you showed the world what happens when that power is abused." The officers looked at him, their eyes darting to the crowd, to the phones, to the witnesses who refused to leave. They realized the truth in his words. This moment was no longer theirs to control. Marcus bent down once more, collecting the last of his belongings. He placed them back into his pockets with deliberate care, each small action echoing louder than the officer's weak excuses. When he stood again, he looked around at the crowd, his voice calm but filled with strength. "Thank you for standing here. Thank you for watching. Your eyes are the light that exposes darkness." The people cheered, some clapping, some whistling, others raising their fists in solidarity. The officers, shrinking in the background, looked more and more like shadows fading from power. The second officer muttered under his breath, but the words carried in the silence. "We're finished here." He turned toward the patrol car, motioning for his partner to follow. The taller one hesitated, his pride keeping him frozen for a moment, but the chants and the cameras were too much. Finally, he lowered his head and followed his partner back to the car. The crowd erupted, their cheers now triumphant. Someone shouted, "They're leaving." Another voice added, "They thought they could get away with it, but not tonight." Marcus stood in the center of it all, calm and steady, his quiet presence commanding more respect than any badge of authority could force. He didn't gloat, didn't shout, didn't raise his hands in victory. He simply stood, breathing in the cool night air, letting the cheers wash over him. As the patrol car pulled away slowly, the flashing lights fading into the distance, Marcus remained rooted in place. He looked at the people who had gathered, their faces lit with admiration and relief. Some approached him, patting his shoulder, thanking him for his courage. Others simply nodded, their respect clear in their eyes. Marcus offered them a small smile. "Tonight wasn't about me," he said softly. "It was about truth. About showing that dignity can't be stripped away, no matter how hard someone tries." The crowd quieted, listening intently. His words carried like a lesson, simple yet powerful. Every person here deserves respect, badge or no badge. That's what justice means. And that's what we should never forget. The people nodded, their agreement loud even in their silence. The chants faded, replaced by murmurs of respect and gratitude. Some lingered, still recording, still talking, still processing the night's events. Marcus finally turned, his steps slow but steady, moving down the street he had begun walking only an hour earlier. But everything had changed. He wasn't just walking home now. He was walking as a symbol, a reminder of resilience, a figure of quiet strength. Behind him, the street buzzed with the voices of witnesses who would carry his story forward. The videos would spread, the truth would travel, and the officer's actions would not be forgotten. Marcus didn't need to announce it, he knew justice had already begun its work. The night that had started with suspicion and humiliation ended with dignity and truth. And though Marcus walked alone, he carried with him the power of every voice that had risen in his defense. The officers had tried to strip him, but instead, they had stripped themselves of honor. And as Marcus disappeared down the street, the people stayed behind, still talking, still sharing, still recording. The story would live on, carried by those who had seen it with their own eyes. The tables had turned, and the truth was now unstoppable. The following morning, the city was buzzing. Videos from the street had already spread across social media, shared thousands of times before sunrise. Clips of Marcus standing tall, calm, while the officers tried to strip away his dignity played on phones, laptops, and televisions. People who hadn't even been there now felt as if they had stood on that very sidewalk, watching the moment unfold. The headline scrolling across screens said it all: "Officers humiliate man then discover he's a federal agent." Marcus woke early, not because he wanted to, but because his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages poured in from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had somehow found his number. Some sent words of support. Others sent screenshots of the video with captions like, "You showed real strength," or "This is the courage we all need." Sitting at his small kitchen table, Marcus scrolled through the endless stream. He was humbled, but also thoughtful. He hadn't set out to become a symbol. He had simply endured, refusing to let humiliation break him. Now, people were seeing him as something larger, proof that dignity, once held, could not be taken. By mid-morning, reporters were outside his building, waiting for him to leave. Their microphones pointed like arrows, their cameras ready to capture every word. Marcus slipped out quietly through a back entrance, not because he was hiding, but because he didn't want the story to become about headlines and noise. He wanted the truth to speak for itself. Meanwhile, the two officers who had confronted him were facing a very different morning. Their names had spread just as quickly as Marcus's, their faces frozen in unflattering stills from the videos, hands grabbing at his clothes, eyes narrowed with arrogance. Their department phones were ringing non-stop, complaints pouring in. Civil rights groups were calling for immediate suspension. Politicians were demanding investigations. What had once been an ordinary night patrol had turned into a scandal shaking the city. Later that day, Marcus attended a quiet meeting with his federal colleagues. They greeted him not with pity, but with respect. His supervisor looked him in the eye and said, "You handled yourself better than most could have. You kept your composure. You let the truth reveal itself. That takes strength." Marcus nodded humbly. "It wasn't about me. It was about what's right. People deserve respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." His words were met with agreement. Many in the room had seen the video, and some admitted it had moved them deeply. One colleague said softly, "You didn't just protect your dignity. You reminded all of us why we wear a badge in the first place." In the days that followed, the videos continued to spread, reaching national news outlets and sparking conversations in living rooms and workplaces across the country. Talk shows invited experts to discuss the incident, and community leaders used the story as an example of quiet strength and the importance of accountability. Marcus, however, remained grounded. He didn't chase interviews or try to shine in the spotlight. He went to work as usual, walked through his neighborhood with calm steps, and greeted people kindly. But everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some shook his hand. Others whispered, "That's him," with admiration. Children pointed at him with wide eyes, as if he were a superhero. One afternoon, as he sat in a small cafe, an older woman approached him slowly. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for standing tall. You showed my grandchildren what it means to keep dignity no matter what." Her words stayed with him long after she left, a reminder that the story had become more than a viral video, it had become a lesson. The officers, on the other hand, were suspended pending investigation. They appeared at press conferences with their heads lowered, mumbling about mistakes and misunderstandings, but the public wasn't convinced. The community wanted accountability, not excuses. The videos had shown the truth plainly: authority without respect was dangerous, and arrogance could be exposed in a single moment. Marcus didn't feel joy in their downfall. He didn't celebrate their punishment. He only hoped they would reflect on their actions and learn that a badge should represent fairness, not fear. He wished for change, not revenge. Weeks later, Marcus was invited to speak at a community gathering. The room was filled with people of all ages, their eyes fixed on him as he stepped to the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, taking a deep breath. "I didn't ask to become a symbol," he began softly. "I was just a man walking home. But what happened that night wasn't just about me. It was about how we treat each other. Respect should never depend on appearance. Dignity isn't something anyone should try to strip away. It belongs to us all." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus raised his hand gently to quiet them. He continued, his voice steady. "The badge in my pocket revealed the truth, but let me be clear, I shouldn't have needed it. I was worthy of respect before that badge was shown, and so is every person in this room. We must hold on to that truth." Tears filled the eyes of some listeners. Others nodded firmly, clapping their hands against their legs in agreement. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just a federal investigator. He was a voice reminding people of something simple, something powerful: that dignity was universal. After the event, people came forward to thank him. Some told their own stories of being judged unfairly, of moments when they had felt small in the face of authority. Marcus listened quietly, offering them comfort and reminding them that their voices mattered too. The story eventually faded from headlines, replaced by other news, but it never disappeared completely. It lingered in conversations, in classrooms, in community meetings. Teachers used it as an example of courage. Parents told their children about it at the dinner table. Activists pointed to it as proof that calm resistance could reveal the truth. For Marcus, life moved on. He returned to his routines, his quiet walks, his long days at work. But nothing was quite the same. Strangers greeted him with respect. Neighbors waved with admiration. And deep inside, he carried a renewed sense of purpose, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the simple truth that one man's calm could inspire many. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus thought back to that evening on the street. He remembered the cold air, the flashing lights, the voices of the officers trying to strip him of dignity. But what he remembered most was the moment he held his badge in his hand, the way the crowd gasped, the way the truth shone brighter than any attempt to cover it. And in those moments of reflection, he smiled softly to himself. They had tried to break him. Instead, they had revealed him. Marcus's story became more than an incident. It became a reminder that respect cannot be demanded with threats, that dignity cannot be stolen by force, and that truth, once revealed, has the power to echo far beyond a single night.